I found that really what great investors do is they have a lattice work of mental models. They have these things that they fall back on that are true, and they know which ones to pull out when. And I know a few weeks ago on your podcast, you guys had Howard Marks on the show, and he's an example of someone, with his memos and his books, and just like you just hear him, and he has these mental models that he falls back on. And like, for instance, I heard him at a conference back in October of 2022, and people were asking him like, what's your opinion of the future? And he was like, this is such a great mental model. He's like, okay, you can't really predict the future, and those that predict the future don't do a very good job. But that doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. It means that when you have an opinion, you should realize with humility that you're probably not right and weight that accordingly.
I just wanted to jump right into this interview and dive into some of the lessons I learned from this book. And one of the profound insights I discovered from reading your book was the reality that humans are just incredibly uncomfortable with uncertainty. Can you share with the audience why we're hardwired in this way of wanting nothing to do with uncertainty at all, and how this hardwiring potentially affects our behavior as investors?
Yeah, sure. So I've been fascinated with uncertainty and how, I personally, and then my clients, and then, humans in general deal with uncertainty for a long time. And in fact, I thought the book I was going to write was going to be completely about uncertainty. So, even though the title is The Uncertainty Solution, and it's the theme that runs throughout the book, really the book, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is more about investment mental models. But yeah, so what's fascinating is that uncertainty, or our quest for certainty, to resolve uncertainty, is what's known as a primary human motive. So we may not even understand that a lot of our actions and what we do, really an underpinning is the fact that we don't like uncertainty. And it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. So if you think back, if you were a human living in, 10 or 100,000 years ago, your ability to recognize patterns gave you a survival advantage, because if you recognize a pattern and then the pattern persists, it allows you to see into the future, which is a huge survival advantage. So if you can recognize the patterns of, let's say, migration of prey, or, weather patterns, or those berries or mushrooms, are they nutritious or are they poisonous? I mean, all sorts of patterns gives you a survival advantage. So the way we've evolved is that when we can see a pattern, we feel good about things. And when we can't recognize a pattern, which is really the very definition of uncertainty, we become antsy, we become anxious, we worry. It actually, in some instances, can trigger actually our fight or flight response. So there's things that we do in response to uncertainty that we may not even realize are going on. And then once we resolve uncertainty, everything reverses. Instead of the fight or flight response, our parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. It's the relaxation response. We calm down. And importantly, we get a little dose of dopamine, which is pleasurable. It feels good. So really, our relationship with uncertainty is not just straightforward, like, oh, we always dislike uncertainty. We actually like a bit because we love how it feels when we resolve it. So that's why, often we'll not want to know the ending of a novel or a movie. It's why some people like to gamble. It's because they crave let's create some non-threatening uncertainty, and let's ride that, kind of wave of adrenaline and stress, and then feel fantastic when it's resolved. So really fascinating stuff from a physiology and behavioral standpoint.
Mm-hmm. And you tell this sort of a case study where people will turn over rocks, and sometimes they'll get shocked, sometimes they won't. And it ties into the idea of humans not liking uncertainty, where those who experienced the most stress were those who couldn't recognize that pattern that you're referencing.
Yeah.
And if I were to tie that into my own life, I think about the example of like going to a doctor and going to a dentist. Like if I go to a doctor to get a flu shot, I know that sharp pain's coming in my arm, but I'm expecting it. I recognize the pattern. I know it's coming. But if I go to the dentist and it's like, okay, I don't know if this is really going to hurt or not. I don't know which tooth is going to hurt on. And it's almost like psychologically agonizing, that uncertainty that you mention and you discuss in your book.
Yeah, absolutely. And that study is pretty interesting. And really what it found is, as the study volunteers and how fun to like shock people. So this was a video game they played. And if they turned over a virtual rock and there was a virtual snake, they got shocked. So they played around with, could they see a pattern to avoid the shocks? Could they see no pattern? So they got shocked about 50% of the time randomly. And then there was a pattern, which was they're just going to be shocked every time. And that was actually a stress situation similar to being able to avoid the shock. So it went like this, pattern, no pain, low stress, no pattern, 50% pain, high stress, pattern, 100% pain, low stress. So pretty interesting stuff. And to your point, exactly, if you think about it, like if you knew you were going to be shocked, you would just steel yourself against it. But if you didn't know, so like my parents have horses and they have like this, like electric fence. So it's really, just like, it's just like a wire going around acres. Right. And, I remember once like a decade ago, my dad was like, I don't know if the fence is on. Will you touch it and see if it's on? And again, it would be like a pretty big shock. And I was like, no, there's absolutely no way I'm going to touch this fence because I don't know. Right. And he kind of, he kind of goaded me into it and made me feel wimpy. So I did, and it wasn't on. But I remember just like just the adrenaline rush. I can still feel it just thinking about, am I going to get shocked or not? Just the uncertainty was just terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Your book lays out many mental models, as you mentioned, which we're going to be discussing during this episode. Charlie Munger is practically famous for stating that his key to success in investing in life is his ability to develop a latticework of mental models. To open up this piece of the discussion, maybe we could start by just simply defining what a mental model is and explain why having a latticework, as Munger describes, is helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so he talked about this. The first record I could find of it was back in 1994 to a speech to the USC Business School, and really what a mental model is it's just a model we keep in our heads, but it's how the world really works in particular instances. And, in reading about quite a bit in books on mental models, what you come to realize is we all have mental models in our heads, but unless you spend time and effort to put correct ones in, you can have things that aren't true, or you will jump to things, just emotion and make bad decisions without having the appropriate mental models. And it takes study, right? So it's not like, oh, I can just read of something once and there it is. But, one that I love, and this is one that, Charlie Munger has mentioned, is Hanlon's razor. So this is a great example. And, if you've ever sent an email and not gotten a response, you often feel, a little irritated or maybe even hurt, maybe even angry. But that's a great time to apply what's known as Hanlon's razor, which is never attribute malice to that which can adequately be explained by stupidity or, carelessness, sloth, disorganization, what have you. And the theory behind this is that humans don't really have, for the most part, malice in their hearts towards other people, except for, maybe if they're teenage girls, right? And I say that as the father of two girls that are fortunately in their 20s now and kind of went through that valley and have exited the other side. But yeah, so, if you don't get an email returned, or you get ghosted for, a lunch meeting, or your brother forgets your birthday or cut off in traffic, what have you, I think it's great to apply this and go, I'm just going to give this person, the benefit of the doubt. So that's an example of a mental model. And since I learned of this mental model probably 15 years ago, I use it all the time, and it really, saves my own emotions. It saved relationships. I hope people use it with me. I'm not actually that great of an email responder. So that's an example of a mental model. And what I found as I was researching, how to become a better investor, really to help me and my colleagues become better advisors, and then to help our clients be better consumers of investment advice, I found that really what great investors do is they have a lattice work of mental models. They have these things that they fall back on that are true, and they know which ones to pull out when. And I know a few weeks ago on your podcast, you guys had Howard Marks on the show, and he's an example of someone, with his memos and his books, and just like, you just hear him, and he has these mental models that he falls back on. And like, for instance, I heard him at a conference back in October of 2022. And people were asking him, like, what's your opinion of the future? And he was like, this is such a great mental model. He's like, okay, you can't really predict the future. And those that predict the future don't do a very good job. But that doesn't mean you can't have an opinion. It means that when you have an opinion, you should realize with humility that you're probably not right and weight that accordingly. He goes, so with that, I'm going to tell you what I think is coming. And I realize that there's probably a less than 50-50 chance I'm correct. And, at Oaktree, when we invest, we have opinions, but we also build in other scenarios and other things that could happen, and we don't go all in. And like, wow, that is really a great way to think about it. Like, you can have an opinion, but don't go all in.
Given that we have these issues with uncertainty and we have these mental models we can apply, what are some of the best ways we can deal with uncertainty when our instincts are maybe at times even almost forcing us to do something that might be really silly?
Yeah, I think the first step and probably the most important thing is to learn to recognize when you're feeling uncertain and that you are really, flailing around looking for, certainty. Because again, it's something that most people aren't aware of. And even, whether you're aware of it or not, this quest for certainty is going to drive so much of your behavior, even if you don't realize it. So if you can just turn the light on to the fact that you're feeling uncertain and then just own it. So, what I say to myself is, so I have this alternate name that, for takeout and, just because I didn't feel like John totally captures my, the essence of who I am. So this alternate name of Kiefer. And so what I do is I say to myself, when I'm feeling uncertain, I say, Kiefer, you are feeling uncertain, and that's the first and the key step. Like if you can do that, you're most of the way there. And then to recognize, here are the things that people usually do when they're feeling uncertain. And then what should I be doing instead?
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of when there's stock market volatility, people will do something they think is good because it gives them more of a certain outcome. For example, maybe they sell after, a stock market drawdown. They just, they're tired of the uncertainty of, what sort of volatility is going to come in the future. And they just want the certainty of being in cash, no more volatility. And they think it feels good to do that. And they think they're making the right decision, but they're actually making a poor decision because they're acting based on their, primal emotions.
Yeah, exactly. That is spot on. Yeah. And what we usually do when faced with uncertainty, there's a lot of different things, but there's four big ones. And the first one is we have this, what's known as the need for cognitive closure. So when we feel uncertain, what we do is we become hypervigilant, where we look for answers. And what we want is we want an explanation. We want the world to make sense. So we tend to do what's known as seizing and freezing. So we seize on the first explanation that hits our worldview, and then we freeze on it. So we don't want to revisit that uncertainty in the future. So we defend it. So you have the situation of, you have this probably not super well thought out or researched response of seizing on an explanation. And then we freeze on it. That's it. And, I think COVID, the pandemic was this great example of that for so many people, myself included, which is, we didn't know what was happening. So we would seize on explanations for what was happening. And then we would stick with it, even if the science had changed or the virus had changed. And so we tend to, grasp these explanations and, don't tend to change our minds or our worldview. So that's the seizing and then the freezing. Another thing we do is we become information junkies. And I've done this when there's economic uncertainty. I definitely did this in COVID, when COVID-19 was first flaring up, we also get a hit of dopamine when we take in information. And when things are uncertain, and what we want to do is we want to find answers. And especially with the internet and social media and everything, it's more easy than any other time in human history to search for answers and to search for clues. And that can be great. So if you have something that is, unknown that can become known, searching for more information is great. But if you have something that's just unknowable, flailing around searching for information, isn't productive and can actually be counterproductive. You may think that you've come up with answers when there's no real answer. And a great example of this, and another thing we do when we're faced with uncertainty, is we turn to experts for their predictions of the future. And experts definitely can predict the future in areas like, engineering and medicine and, these other things. But, when you have things like the stock market and the economy, or even geopolitics, the ability of experts to predict the future is just really, they have a real poor track record. But we find ourselves, in fact, I have to resist it, clicking on these articles where some, famous guru is telling us what's going to happen in the future. And again, we feel like we've got a dose of certainty when you have somebody that's a confident expert that tells you what's going to happen, in the future. And one of the final things we do is we like to associate with groups that think like we do. And here's in doing research for this book, I came across this comment by a sociologist, which I think is spot on and is one of the biggest things that has shifted my worldview of how people can have such differing views of what the truth or facts or reality is. And that is, the truth is whatever your social group believes it to be. So, whether it's, politics or the economy or, religion or all these other things, like whatever your social group thinks the truth is what you think the truth is. Like, wow. So when we feel uncertain, that's not a time period where we want to go and, debate or hear from people all these differing points of view from our own. We tend to, insulate ourselves in these echo chambers of people that think like we do. So that's what we tend to do when we are feeling uncertain is, seize and freeze. We seek more information, we listen to experts, we surround ourselves with people who feel like we do. And again, most of those things are either not productive or even counterproductive. Just things that, we all should be on the lookout for what we're doing in the face of uncertainty, which really doesn't bear fruit.
Mm-hmm. The last of the four you mentioned there really hits home for me, where people fall into their camp and they fall into the echo chamber, especially with things like social media and falling prey to listening to just specific experts. One of my biggest insights from tuning into William Green's episodes here on the Richer, Wiser, Happier show is that, he mentions it time and time again, is that the world is fundamentally uncertain. And when people fall into these camps, they can become extremely overconfident in what they believe in, and they just continually tune in to this one opinion. And I think it's so empowering to just understand that, there is the possibility that we're wrong, and there's a possibility that maybe the world isn't the way we believe it to be, and we need to position ourselves to account for that uncertainty. And it also ties into that point of Howard Marks earlier that you mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. And we get to the point where, we surround ourselves with people who think the same, and we consume the same media and the same, social media. And it seems like it's not possible that other people think something different. And, I think that's a great example of how you can go down this path of, being in this echo chamber of hearing the exact same things over and over from your social group. And that becomes the truth, right? So that was their truth because of, their social group.
That ties into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is related to people quickly coming to conclusions because, they just see this simple piece of data. They're like, of course, then if this happens, then this is going to happen after that. And you caution in your book that correlation does not necessarily equal causation, and that the world is a complex adaptive system with many different variables that really can't be analyzed in isolation. And you tell this different example in your book of a child's academic achievement, how that turns out in the number of books that the child's parents owns in the household. And it makes sense that, a child, if they're surrounded by parents that have a lot of books, then they're probably more likely to, have better academic performance. But that's not the only variable at play. There's people with more books in their household might just generally read more. They might do other things. They might be, push for higher education, things like that. Can you expand on this idea that because humans don't like uncertainty, we're prone to quickly jumping to conclusions that are either too simplified or maybe not even true?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I have an entire chapter in my book called Looking for Causes in All the Wrong Places. So it's all about causation and correlation and, full of stories and examples. And the one you mentioned on, books and educational attainment looked at, the number of books in a home and, educational outcomes over, 27 different countries. And this study was popularized in the book Freakonomics. And it's, really the point of the Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner said in Freakonomics as they dug into this was, really the answer is that there's this common cause. So if educational success is the result, the books, having the books in the home didn't cause that. It was a symptom of the sort of parents that they were, right? Both their genetics and, their view of learning. The type of person that buys a lot of books was correlated with higher educational outcome. Their children having a higher educational outcome. So it was like this common cause, right? Smart educated people buy more books. Smart educated people tend to have children that go on and achieve higher educational success. So that was that example there. And there's all these other things with causation. And again, it comes back to our dislike of uncertainty. Like we want the world to make sense and we want to have a cause or an explanation. And sometimes it's difficult. And, another story I tell in the book, which was really quite humbling, is I was at this investment conference, years ago, probably, it was probably 5 years ago. And you know how these investment conferences go, like you have all day of like talks and everything. And then you have like a cocktail hour and then dinner. So, as I'm, sipping my, probably $12 bottle, glass of wine, I was talking to this woman who's the CEO of an investment firm. And it was pretty new. It was only around for 3 or 4 years. And I was like, so what does your firm do? And she said, oh, what we do is very simple. We only invest in companies that have strong female leadership, either, female, CEO or president or, females on the board. And it's because, female-led companies outperform male-dominated ones. And I was like, wow, that is amazing. So I instantly was thinking like, that makes total sense, right? Like, and I dug into the research when I got back to work. And, there was all this research that supported the fact that female-led companies, outperform. And it's things like, women are more risk adverse. So, their companies won't maybe have, the same propensity to blow up. Women consumers make 70% of the buying choices. So maybe they're more in tune with their fellow females. More diverse teams outperform. There's, female leadership style, stereotypically is more nurturing. And then if you've made it to, president or CEO or on the board of directors of a company and you're a female, because of the glass ceiling, you're probably totally a rock star. So maybe these female-led companies have stronger leaders because they've had to run this gauntlet. It's like, this is amazing. So, not long after this conference and looking at this research, I was meeting with a client of mine who's one of the smartest people I know. And he led this Fortune, 100 company as CEO. And I was telling him about this investment firm. I was like, it's pretty interesting. We're looking into it as an investment. And he's like, yeah, but is there really a causal link? Like, where is that causal link? Are you sure that there's not like a common cause or like, is this a symptom? So I was like, oh my gosh, maybe he's right. Like my first reaction was to dig in and defend, but like I have so much respect for him. Like I think if most other people would have questioned me, I'm like, no, I've researched this. This is good. But I decided to do something that's really hard and battling something is known as confirmation bias. Is I was like, now I'm going to go try to find studies that disprove this. And I found ones that took the other side. And really to summarize those, it basically said that when you have a company that's doing really well, highly successful company, that they have more resources to spend on things like diversity. And, there was this psychologist that had dug into this that said, it's almost like a cynical measure by like companies saying we're going to recycle our annual reports, or, we're going to, buy carbon credits, as almost PR, that maybe high performing firms are more likely to hire female leaders and female board members. And there isn't, the jury's still out. What hasn't been done so far, at least as of about 2 years ago when I last researched this, there haven't been longitudinal studies between companies to really tease this out. So I'm not saying that, strong female leadership isn't a cause of high performance. In fact, our company, I'm president of our company, but our CEO is a woman who's incredible. And, we have 70% female employees here. So I'm a big fan of, female leadership and female led firms. But, the jury is out, and, I had kind of jumped to, this causation explanation. And it, my client's point was a great one. Maybe it's a symptom instead of a cause. And, I go through a lot of those things in this, like that in the chapter, which is really, teasing apart, how to look at things and to say, is this just merely correlated instead of cause? Is it a common cause? Is there the observation effect? Understanding that there's often multiple causes. It's hard to pin down, a linear, relationship. So it's, I think it's an interesting area and one that's absolutely essential to understand as an investor.
You tell another story in your book of how you were on vacation in another country and you were out for dinner with your wife, and you ran into an old friend at a restaurant thinking that, how could this happen? This is just so improbable that it practically felt like a miracle to you that fate put you at the same restaurant in this different country in the same city of how big the world is. It just seems like it's totally impossible. But then you make the case in your book that highly improbable scenarios are actually to be expected. So I'd love for you to dive into this and talk about how the improbable can seemingly happen all the time.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, this topic is in some respects kind of a bummer, right? Because we all love a good coincidence, and it's great to look at a coincidence and think, okay, this shows that there's this, that there's more meaning to the world, right? Like there's this underlying, ebb and flow that maybe we don't understand as humans, and life does have meaning or what have you. So when I have given talks on this topic, people have been like, wow, that was really a buzzkill. But so we were in Paris, and we get seated at our table, and one table over is this fraternity brother of mine. I hadn't seen him in years, and his name's Dave. And Dave was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like, how improbable is this? And one way to look at it is, and I first thought, oh yeah, what are the chances? 1 in 100 million? This is insane. But really the way to look at it is not the way that I initially looked at it or Dave looked at it, which is wow, the universe is telling us something. Maybe we should reconnect and become friends again, right? That fate's saying something. But really, to step back, the way to analyze this is to say, what are the chances that in all my travels that I would see somebody, whether, in a movie theater or on a bus, in a museum, seated next to dinner, that I knew from, the thousands of people that I've known during my life. And, it's still a coincidence and it's still fun, but it's not 1 in 100 million. It's more like, okay, over the course of decades, it's almost certain that this sort of thing will happen. And there's something, a way to think about this. There's something called Littlewood's law of miracles. And what this mathematician did is he said, okay, how often do we experience what you would consider a miracle? Like me being seated next to a fraternity brother, in a restaurant in Paris. And he said, let's define a miracle as a 1 in a million occurrence. And then he calculated how many occurrences do we have a day? And he came up with, there's about 1,000, 30,000 things that you observe and see, during a day. And so if you do that and you multiply it by the number of days in a month, you come up with, you're going to hit one of these 1 in a million things about once a month. And even if you say, well, 30,000 a day is too high, maybe it's, 20,000 or 10,000 or 5,000 a day, you still come up with the fact that, many times a year, you're going to have just absolutely extraordinary coincidences that are just amazing. And, Richard Feynman, who is a Nobel Prize winning physicist and just an all around entertaining guy. And, unfortunately he's not alive anymore, but He has this book that he wrote, this kind of memoirs called "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman," which is I highly recommend. Incredibly entertaining. But one thing that he's known to say is, here on the, I'm going to paraphrase, on the way to dinner tonight, I saw something extraordinary, a car with the license plate AEW 357. Isn't that amazing, right? And his point is there's nothing special about that license plate. It's just one of the 30,000 things that we see a day. But if it had somehow been, my initial, and my year of birth or so, something, it would have been just like this extraordinary, like, oh my gosh, the universe is talking to me, occurrence. So really the mental model here is that the highly improbable happens all the time because there's this, just huge, tens of thousands of things that happen every month. And if that's the case, we need to train ourselves not to read too much into, patterns that we see that really aren't grounded in anything other than randomness and chance.
If I were to tie that into investing, I would say that you want to always account for the improbable scenarios. If you're ever considering doing something like using leverage or concentrating into one particular asset, you should always account for the fact that no matter how certain you are on this particular strategy, to always, do things like diversify and have excess cash to take into account for those improbable type scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The improbable scenarios happen all the time. And yet we, as humans and it's human nature, we seem surprised almost every time it happens. If it's something like, being seated next to somebody at a dinner at a foreign city, that's just kind of fun. But to your point, sometimes these improbable things, really can have an extreme effect on our actual lives. And yet we end up being surprised by them.
I think one oversimplified assumption that people make that you talk about in your book is that if the economy is doing poorly, or if people even think the economy is going to do poorly in the future, then their stocks are going to go down or the stock market isn't going to perform well. But you make this brilliant point that the stock market is not the economy, which might be obvious to some people and maybe a surprise to others. And you share this great Howard Marks quote that in investing, there is nothing that always works since the environment is always changing, and investors' efforts to respond to the environment cause it to change further. Why is it that the stock market is not necessarily directly correlated to what's happening in the economy? Hey everyone, it's Clay Fink here. Are you looking for an investment opportunity in a $2 trillion market? Look no further than Atacama, the cybersecurity industry's latest game changer. Atacama has opened its doors to US accredited and international investors alike, already attracting over 5,000 investors and $6.5 million in capital. Atacama's recurring revenue model saw 10x revenue expansion in 2022 alone. They have patented technology and large contracts secured, including one with the US Department of Defense. This is a limited time opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a rapidly growing cybersecurity startup. To learn more, simply visit invest.atacama.com/WSB. That is invest.atacama.com/WSB. Full disclosure, I have personally invested in Atacama's equity crowdfunding round at a $29 million valuation. Please keep in mind that investments in early stage companies do contain risk. As with any investment, crowdfunding investments do offer attractive potential upside, but they cannot offer any guarantees of a future return.
This is probably, from a pure straight up investment standpoint, the most important mental model in the book. And again, let me just touch a bit deeper on the stock markets, not the economy, and then we can maybe hit why that is. But this really, what this says is that what's going on in the economy and what's going on in the stock market are uncorrelated. So if you look at current year GDP growth and current year stock market returns, going back to World War II, the correlation is 0.03, so basically zero. And what this means is there's years where the economy is roaring and the stock market is not doing well or even down. And there's years where there's recessions the stock market is up. So in fact, looking back to the 1930s of, the 19 years where there's actually been negative GDP growth in a year. In other words, during a calendar year, 12 of those 19 years, the stock market was up, and most of the time more than 18%. And so you can look at it and go, well, that's bonkers. Like, how is it that you have a contracting economy and a stock market that's up? But what's fascinating, and this came out of research I read that came from Credit Suisse. So I'll just say that name because that name is going away, as we all know, as they're being subsumed by UBS. I think here in the next few months. But really, if you look at the prior year stock market returns and the current year GDP, then the correlation jumps to, kind of a 0.6 and above, meaning that, that the stock market predicts what the economy is going to do, not perfectly, kind of an ish, right? But the economy doesn't predict what the stock market's going to do. And as an investor, you'd love to have it reversed, right? You'd love to say, because it's easier to kind of figure out, not, what's going on in the economy and say, okay, I'm going to use that to inform my investing. So, you could say, oh, I think, inflation is a problem, and interest rates, the Fed raising interest rates going to slow the economy. And therefore, we may not tip into recession, but we're definitely going to have slower growth here for a while, right? And then if you could take that and say, now I'm going to use that to, kind of time my investments, that would be amazing, right? But that's not how it works. So the stock market moves in advance of the economy, typically up and down, and tells you what the economy is going to do, which is has some usefulness. But as an investor, it's just not very useful. And so what that means is pretty much every economic indicator out there doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the stock market. And, I've been on a number of like charitable investment committees over the years, and even chair of, some endowments. And we'll have these investment managers or these consultants come in, and they'll give us their economic update. And they'll talk about all these things going on in the economy, their views of, the path of interest rates and inflation and unemployment claims and GDP growth and corporate earnings and all these things. And then based on that, they'll talk about how they would tweak the portfolio and, what they're missing out there. And I'll talk to some of them, and I'll say, you do realize that all those things you just listed out don't tell you what's going to happen with stock market returns. And some of them are surprised by this. The more erudite ones go, well, we know. And I'm like, well, then why did you spend, half hour talking about them? But it means that all these economic indicators don't tell you what the stock market's going to do, which is, again, it may seem like depressing and like, oh, well, that's telling us there's no Santa Claus. But knowing that is so important. So like during COVID, when things were getting really bad, we didn't go to our clients and say, let's take some risk off the table and move out of the market. In fact, if anything, we rebalanced into stocks, not thinking that we knew when the bottom was. We just knew that all the bad news in the real world and in the economy wasn't going to tell us when the stock market was going to bottom or what the stock market was going to do. So, it was, kind of this incredibly short bear market that was very steep, and then this great rebound. And I think, people that looked at all the bad news, they missed it. They didn't invest their money, or they pulled money out. And, the bottom was March 23rd of March 2000. And on that day, or like 3 days later, they announced the 1,000th COVID death in America. I mean, imagine, like if somebody, think about this, Clay, if somebody said, hey, guess what? I have a crystal ball, and here's what I'm going to tell you. Okay, we just hit 1,000 deaths. We're going to have nearly, 350,000 in the US by the end of the year. It's going to hit, 1 million or 2 million, worldwide. Travel's going to, international travel is going to shut down, and pro sports leagues are going to stop, and all these restaurants are going to fail. Entire industries are going to be decimated. GDP growth this quarter is going to be a negative 14 something percent. Unemployment is going to spike to nearly 15%. Here in a week or two, we're going to have 3 million weekly unemployment claims. Like if we knew all that, and oh, by the way, this is going to go on for years. Like if we knew all that, like we would be like, okay, we're taking our money out of the market. But if you use the stock market is not the economy, that you can't use what's going on, or even if you knew what was going on in the economy, you can't use that to inform what's going on in the stock market. In fact, I wrote an article in Forbes on March 26, 3 days after the bottom, that said, even with a recession looming, that doesn't mean you should sell the stock market. And I went through a lot of these things and I had people say, wow, how did you know? How did you call the bottom? And they're missing the point. Like, I didn't call the bottom. I had no idea. The point of the article is we have no idea. Could it have gotten worse? Absolutely. Why was that the bottom? Don't know exactly. Right. So I think that's what's important to know about, this middle model. The stock market's not the economy. And if we move to like, why is that the case? Right. And that's where we get into this concept of complex adaptive systems. And, this really comes from engineering, but it is applicable to complex social interactions. So this is true of politics, it's true of the economy, it's true of the stock market. And the idea here is that in the economy and, in the stock market, you have actors that are intelligent called agents. So these are all the people and all the companies that, buy and sell stocks. So they're intelligent. So they don't operate on rules of physics, like Newtonian physics or even the theory of relativity, right? It's everybody watching each other, watch everybody else, right? So we're all trying to decide what everybody's doing. And if you think about investing, the true value of a company is what the market says it is, which means everybody else. And we learn from patterns. So we have these feedback loops, we have external information. So you can use, like, for example, let's use like GameStop. So, going back to the meme stock, from early 2021. And, really there was no underlying, sound, fundamental, like economic reason why GameStop would do well. Really, it was, this chat group on Reddit that started driving it up. And so people bought shares of GameStop because they thought other people would buy shares of GameStop. And, it was AMC as well. And, Bed Bath & Beyond, which just declared bankruptcy, unfortunately. But then what this did is this caused real world effects. So like what AMC did, which was brilliant, is they said, hey, like if these Reddit people are going to push up the value of our stock, we're going to issue more stock. We're going to gain, all this like extra financial footing. So they started issuing shares of stock, which in turn, gave the company more money to ride out, the problems with movie theaters and everything. So it created these real world effects, which in turn made people go, oh, well, maybe we should buy AMC. It was fascinating that this sort of thing happened. But what it means is, with a complex adaptive system, is you can't take the inputs and know what the outputs are going to be. It's like toilet paper hoarding in the pandemic. Like going into the pandemic, like Clay, if I was like, what do you think if, people are going to hoard some stuff, what's it going to be? Like, if you're like me, I probably would have said jugs of water or cans of beans or, I don't know, something useful to survival, not toilet paper. But once it happened, individual rational actions, which is, if you see some toilet paper, buy it. Like, don't let that package of toilet paper pass you by because you don't know how long this is going to go on. But that further created this action, this irrational outcome system-wide, which is a toilet paper shortage, which was bonkers. And, I was part of this in April of 2020. I was in Walgreens picking up a prescription and I saw, this mostly empty shelf of toilet paper. And there was one package there and I bought it, even though we didn't need it. And I was telling the checkout clerk, I'm so sorry I'm buying this. We have plenty of toilet paper. I'm being part of the problem, not part of the solution. And, she was looking at me like, just, I have no idea what you're talking about. Just check out, stop exposing me to your possible COVID, So that's really how the stock market and the economy work is, all these individual actors that are intelligent and learning and reacting to patterns. And that's why it's so hard to predict, what's going to happen in the stock market or in the economy. And this is why experts get it wrong over and over again, because it's just not something that can be modeled well. And it's why, patterns that have persisted in the stock market in the past won't necessarily work in the future. It's because, we've learned from the prior patterns and, once a prior pattern is known, then everybody knows it. And you have to have a buyer for every seller and a seller for every buyer. Right. So anyway, I've probably been just getting too excited about these two mental models, but, there you go.
I wanted to tap more into the great financial crisis. I didn't personally experience the dot-com bust or the great financial crisis as an investor myself. So it's always interesting to draw from the experience of others who actually lived through it. And I took this piece from your book that the market bottomed on March 9th, 2009, after a 57% drop. And the trough of the recession in economic growth didn't come until 4 months later in June. And, it just ties directly into, since the economy is not the stock market, just because the economy is going down, the stock market actually rebounded 4 months before the economy rebounded. And I'd love for you to tell the story of the hedge fund manager you chatted with during that time. And you chatted with him and he was just, screaming, more pain to come. And you actually decided not to make any changes to your client's portfolio. So I'd love for you to tell this story.
Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, let me say that like the great financial crisis, the Great Recession, wow, like it's one of the really seminal things, experiences I've had in my life. It was so stressful. Like I felt all this responsibility for our clients' assets. And I really, I hadn't developed all these mental models and I didn't know what to do, and I was this big consumer of financial information. Like my amount of knowledge about what's going on in the economy and the markets was greater than it is now. So what I was lacking is, kind of the Charlie Munger, wisdom, mental models to make good decisions. And so it was really the great financial crisis that was the impetus for me, writing this book is all that I've learned. Because I realized after that experience that I wanted to find, what did great investors do? What do they know that I could learn and use to help my clients? So that really spurred me on the financial crisis. And yeah, so in February of 2009, and what I was doing is, trying to find more information about, like, I couldn't see how, we were going to get out of this, and I know that the entire global financial system almost collapsed. I don't even know what that means. I just know it's really bad, and I was reading all these economists and investment managers that were just saying, there's no way out and everything's going to get worse. And so I'd gone to a conference the prior year where I had met, this hedge fund manager that had given a talk, and he was so impressive and their returns were great. And, kind of back in the aughts, hedge funds were, the kind of the darling investment and money was flowing into them. And this guy was so impressive and had all these, this pedigree and everything. And I ended up, having an adult beverage with him in the cocktail hour of the investment conference. We had exchanged cards. So I'll call him Tom, as I do in the book. It's not his real name, but I ended up emailing him and setting up a time to talk. And again, it was on the phone. Back in 2009, we didn't Zoom and Skype and everything. And I asked him, I was like, what do you see happening? What's our way out of this? And he said, this, what we've experienced so far is just an appetizer to like this much bigger meal of misery that we're gonna have. And he said that they'd moved their hedge fund mostly to cash and gold, and like a $3 billion hedge fund, and they'd moved it almost out, and they were pretty sure that the stock market, which was at this point down nearly 50% in February of 2009, was going to be down another 50%. And the way that math would work, I guess that'd be like 70, over 75% down from the high. And he was at the time just so incredibly dour, and he had all these great reasons. And there were things that I'd read before, but to read someone that had actually said, okay, we're, really selling our clients out. And he said he had even bought farmland in New Jersey because he lived in New York City. And he had like this stockpile of gold coins to buy passage out of New York City which he thought was a decent chance, if the economy collapsed. He was like, it's going to be like, Escape from New York stuff. If the old movie, by the way, which was filmed in St. Louis, go figure. But the old movie Escape from New York, he was just like, I'm going to be able to get my buy passage out of New York City, and maybe gold has always been a store of value for most of civilization, and he had like guns and generators and seeds and everything, and he was going to like live off the land in like rural New Jersey. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I am so upset, and I remember talking to a few of my coworkers, and, fortunately, they kind of talked me off the ledge, and I, did like breathing exercises and meditated. And they're just like, okay, it's just one opinion. I'm like, yeah, but there's a lot of people with similar opinions. But, I think cooler heads prevailed because it really, really freaked me out, but I look back on that, in addition to being an entertaining story in retrospect. And by the way, what he predicted could have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Like it could have happened. It just didn't. And, later in my book, I talk about something called invisible histories, which are things that could have happened, but didn't. So I look back not just to be like, and I say something funny in my book, like, whenever I look back, think back on this story, I think about, Tom sitting in a cellar in New Jersey, like with a shotgun across his lap, eating a can of peaches, right? Or something, but, which I thought was kind of funny. But I really have more sympathy for this, and if you're a hedge fund manager, maybe you're all about making big calls, and he could have been correct. But I use this as a mental model to remember that, even if you have all the possible information you can have, you're, this highly pedigreed, hedge fund manager with all this staff and this analysis and research, that it doesn't mean that you're going to be any better than anybody else from, calling, what's going to happen in the stock market. And, about a month later is when the market bottomed, and, his hedge fund, and I haven't gone back and checked it out, but, they may well have gone out of business because they'd moved everybody to cash and gold and missed the, from March 9th, 2009 to, the end of 2022, even with 2022's down period, stock market's been up over 600%. So yeah, that was a costly mistake. And just, it reminds you that, even though he could have been right, this idea that you need to know what's going to happen in the future and that you should follow expert predictions to invest, it's just a great example of why, none of us should invest based on our own or others' predictions of the future.
I think this ties well into a point you make from your favorite investment book, which is The Success Equation by Michael Maubbousin, who has been on the show back in 2021, I believe. In it, he has what he calls the skill luck continuum, where certain activities fall somewhere on the spectrum of primarily being skill-based or primarily being luck-based. Based on your research and writing this book, where do you think investing falls on this spectrum?
Yeah. First, let me tell you my Michael Maubbousin story. So I was like, I got this certificate, this professional certificate from Harvard in behavioral finance and decision making, right? And so, like on the first morning of this program, I get on the hotel elevator, which was the recommended hotel, and there he is on the elevator. He's very tall. He's like 6'4", 6'5", probably. Maybe.
What are the chances?
I know. What are the chances? And he's on the elevator. Actually, the chances are pretty good since he was one of the faculty for the professional certificate. And so it was like just me and him on the elevator. And I felt like, like, I don't know, like my daughter Claire would, if she like got on the elevator with like Taylor Swift. I was like, oh my goodness, you're Michael Maubbousin. And he just like looks at me and he's like, yes, I am. And who are you? And it was like this weird, just like fanboy, interaction that I had with him. Is kind of embarrassing. I ended up talking to him and getting to know him a little bit, throughout the rest of the program, but I still, was just like, oh my gosh, like I'm so like starstruck or whatever. Yeah. And of his books, The Success Equation, and it's really my favorite investment book because it's had, this outsized, maybe the biggest impact on how I view the investment world, and really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And yeah, his skill luck continuum, is pretty fun because it's not just investing, at one end of the pure luck is, like roulette and slot machines. You can put the lottery there, just complete luck. And at the other end, things that are 100% skill, like chess is 100% skill, and things that are pretty close to full skill, which are like race. So like, a running race, like, a 100-meter race, running race, or, in swimming. So if you think about it, like Michael Phelps, he's going to be a less skilled competitor pretty much every time. There's very little luck involved. I guess he could like, slip a little bit, coming off the block, or have a, something happen. But really, I guess, that falls within skill. But then you look at a lot of sports, and, they vary in how much, luck is involved. I love hockey, and, all the time, you'll watch your your team, and your team will hit the goalpost a few times. You'll lose, or vice versa happens, or you're watching football and the game winning field goal hit doinks off the uprights, or there's all sorts of things that happen that you can see where luck comes into play. But really, and he did all this study and research and analysis, and what he found is investing falls way down towards the luck end of the continuum. Skill matters, but it's way, it's definitely much more towards, gambling. And some gambling like poker, has a lot of skill, but it's much more down towards, the roulette than it is up towards, chess or, swim races. And he asked a few great questions that we all can ask to tell where an activity falls in the continuum. And the first is, can an amateur beat a pro? And, the answer on skill-based things is no. Like I don't play chess. So if I played my nephew, who is, this incredible chess player, like I'd have zero chance of beating him. And I swim. And if I swam against Michael Phelps, like it would be laughable, like, or ran a running race against like a college, or even high school, track, person, they would just, they would cream me. And, same thing. If I, played 1-on-1 basketball or horse against like a college basketball player, like all those things, like an amateur cannot beat a pro. Whereas if you think about roulette, like, can an amateur roulette player beat a pro roulette player? Yeah, of course. Like it's random, right? And, or slot machine, like, can an amateur slot machine player win? Right. And if you think about investing, an amateur can beat a pro all the time, and I tell the story in my book of, in 2020, the highest performing portfolio. So we only work with about 60 families, but that rolled up to, hundreds of portfolios, of all the different family members and entities and trusts and everything. And our highest performing portfolio in 2020 was that of a middle schooler that, we'd helped her, set up an account at Schwab, and, we're educating her on stocks, and like, oh, what stocks would you like to buy? And I think she had like, $1,000 for her grandparents. And, she picked like Netflix and, Tesla and I forget what the third was, but it was like some of the highest performing stocks of 2020. So there were like 3 or 4 stocks. And, we went back and looked at like, what can we learn about the high versus low performing portfolios? And so this middle schooler was the top performing. And so it just shows you that, an amateur can beat a pro in investing, and it happens all the time, especially over shorter periods. And then on the other question he asked, which is so good, is can you lose on purpose? So if the outcome is mainly based on skill, you can lose on purpose. So like I could, my nephew in chess could choose to lose to me on purpose. He could intentionally make poor moves. Or if I was swimming against somebody that was a better swimmer, they could choose to swim slower and I would win. Or, I raced my, now 6-year-old nephew, and like, I'm still faster than he is. So I could choose, as I usually do, to lose. Every once in a while, I choose to win, but mostly I choose to lose. Right. And the same thing's in investing true of stocks. Like, can you lose on purpose? And, when I ask this question to people, that they often say, oh, well, yeah. The answer is no, not really. Because if you could pick stocks in advance that weren't going to do well, you could make a ton of money as a short biased, stock picker. You could short stocks. And there are basically, like no famous short managers, because it is so hard to do that. In general, stocks go up. So pick the ones that go down, or even to pick the ones that are relatively don't do as well as others is incredibly hard to do, because, long short hedge funds, their history and their performance hasn't been great. So it just really shows you that, investing, skill does matter, but there's a huge component of luck. And what this means is when you see an investment manager or a middle schooler that does really, really well, it behooves us not to read too much into their performance. Or if they do really poorly, we can't read too much in their performance. I mean, if picking a star investment manager that was going to outperform in the future was merely as simple as how they performed in the past, and let's pile into the ones that have done well, that would be easy. But, what studies of public stock managers has shown is there's basically no persistence from year to year to year. And, very few investment managers over long periods of time show that they have skill and they deliver outperformance beyond their fees. So there's a lot that have skill, but just not, in excess of their fees, or especially, the taxes that might be generated. So what it means is picking a manager, someone that's going to, buy stocks for you, that's going to outperform. Picking a manager like that is really hard because there's so much luck involved and it's so hard to tease out skill.
Mm. I think a key part of that last point with the difficulty of success in investing over long periods of time is that times are continually changing.
Yes.
An investor might have a really good decade, but if they apply that same exact strategy the next decade, then odds are they aren't going to do as well because just times change and the environment changes.
Yeah, that is so true. It's really hard. And what happens is, as an investment manager, and as a wealth manager myself, we live this, which is, there's ways to invest that you have a high likelihood that you're going to beat the market. But the problem with them is that it takes a lot of time for you to be correct. And there'll be a lot of time where you look horrible. And in fact, Vanguard did a study of investment managers that had over a 15-year period that both survived and then beat the market. And of the over 1,500 funds they looked at, only 18% actually beat the market over the 15-year period. And that's pretty consistent with other studies by S&P and others that have looked at the success of active managers. But what was fascinating, of the 18%, 2/3 had 5 or more years of underperformance. So 5 years out of 15 years, if I do my math correctly, is 1/3. And a lot of them had 6, 7, 8 years of underperformance. And also the majority of them had at least 3 years of consecutive underperformance. And so what that means in the real world is, if you're an investment manager and you're like, okay, I'm going to outperform, but I know that I'm going to look like a lot of the time. The problem is your investors likely won't be sticky, and that after 3 years of consecutive underperformance, or 4 or 5 even, or, I'm underperforming 5 or 6 or 7 out of 15 years, you'll have people fire you and you will go out of business. So what the investment managers do is they change their strategy so they don't get fired, or they invest in a way that is, very similar to what the market is, and they just tweak it a bit so they don't look too different. And it's really a business decision, and it's really based on it's really based on the investor. It's really the investors, and there's this idea that if you could invest maybe with a manager that has a lockup. So imagine if you invested with an investment manager that said, I'm going to buy publicly traded stocks, but you can't get out for 10 years. Or you could invest in a publicly traded manager that you can get out every day. I'll tell you that the one that you can't get out of for 10 years, likely, with a high degree of likelihood, will beat the one that you can get out of every day. Because the one that's investing for 10 years is going to invest, over with a long-term view and not be worried about whether their investors are going to pull out, and they won't change their strategy, and they'll stay with something that has, been shown to, likely over long periods of time beat the market.
Mm-hmm. You also touch on some behavioral biases in your book that are, again, hardwired into us, which essentially means we're all susceptible to these to some degree. And 2 very common behavioral biases are loss aversion and overconfidence. And part of me feels like these kind of go at odds with each other. If you're loss averse, then you might not take enough risk. If you're overconfident, you might take too much risk. So I'm curious if you believe that most people are susceptible to both of these to some degree, or do people sort of lean one way or the other that they should be aware of?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really think that they're actually at odds. I think there are things that, each of us applies at different times. And, I'll give you an example. So if you're overconfident, so it means that you think you know more than you do. You're better than you are. You're better looking than you really are. You're a better driver than you are. Better spouse, parent, on down the line. But in terms of investing, again, it means that we think that we know more than we do, or that other people do, that we make better decisions. And then we have this loss aversion, which, at its core states that, losses feel more painful than gains feel good. And so there's these different things that we do when we're faced with decisions with loss aversion. The first is we make decisions to avoid losses, but then importantly, once we're at a loss, we tend to double down. Like we don't want to lock in the loss. And, I think overconfidence there goes hand in hand, because, when you're down and you decide, okay, I'm going to double down, or I'm going to engage in risk-seeking behavior because I don't want to lock in a loss. It just shows right there that you're being overconfident in terms of your abilities. And really, you should step back and go, okay, this investment that I have is down. It's at a loss. What should that teach me about my ability to make investment decisions? If it's just the rest of the market's down, fine. But if it's down, more, if it's an individual stock or other type of investment, maybe you should say to yourself, I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm going to cut my losses instead of, engage in risk-seeking, behavior. But I do, to your point at the beginning of the question, I do think that, these are two of the biggest behavioral biases to be aware of as investors. And I hit 5 of them in that chapter. And, there's entire books and great ones written about, behavioral biases. And I think a key takeaway is, and, my business partner, Spencer Burke, who also my mentor, what he has said over the decades is, you read these books about behavioral biases and a few things happen. First of all, it's human nature, because we're overconfident, that we think about like, oh, other people do these. Like, oh, these other silly people that, are doing risk-seeking behavior when they're at a loss, or these silly people that have hindsight, bias, or that, succumb to confirmation bias, et cetera, et cetera. So we first of all think that we're not as bad as everybody else. And so we need to be like, no, we're as bad. It's like, I'm human just like everybody else. But then the other thing that's sort of insidious is, once you read about these biases, you think that now that you know them, that you're going to be better at them. And what I've found is, so, like I have this professional certificate where, a lot of study and research. It wasn't actually, like a multi-year sort of thing. So maybe it sounds more impressive than it is. But, in prep for that, but also over the years, I've probably read, 15 books on behavioral biases and behavioral aspects of investing and the like. And every time I read about it, I think, oh, okay, I got this, I got this, right? I'm going to be better. And I'll tell you, I think I've gotten a bit better just because I've done so much study over the years. But I think this idea that you can read, like one book or one paper, or like my book, one chapter, and like, okay, you got this, you're going to make this big improvement, to realize that these are hardwired into us. And, a thing I hit in my book is some of the reasons why that is. And I think, behavioral economics or behavioral finance, or whatever you want to call it, tend to talk about these biases and then heuristics, which means, this shortcut that you make, these shortcuts you make in decision making. They talk about them like in this way, like, aren't we flawed? Most of the books. But really, if you dig into like evolutionary psychology, there's really good reasons why we have these biases. And it's because having these biases helped in terms of our survival. So we've evolved to have them. But the situation we're in now is that, like, we have these ancient brains that evolved to be in this time period of, thousands or hundreds of thousands of years ago. But we live in modern times where, we're not being stalked by prey, and we have all this abundance, and, we feel these biases come into play on our decision making when so many of them just aren't as applicable anymore. And that's really our struggle. Because if you think about, like, loss aversion, those ancestors of ours that took action not to lose are the ones that were more likely to survive. Because, back in the day, we'll call it like the caveman days, a mistake could easily lead to your death, or at least your inability to reproduce and, pass your genes down. And it was the ones that were more risk adverse, in an incredibly treacherous world, that survived and passed on their genes, and we are their descendants, right? So, there's a very good reason for us to be loss adverse. But again, as an investor, for most people, it just doesn't make sense to give outsized, outsized focus and emotion to losses as compared to gains in this world of abundance that we live in.
Mm-hmm. And another behavioral bias that I really enjoyed learning more about was how we're just naturally drawn to a really good story. And with a lot of investments, people, have almost perfected the art of telling a good story around it to almost pitch it. So what should we know about storytelling to help prevent us from being persuaded into a potentially poor investment?
Yeah. So this is something that isn't talked about a whole lot when it comes to investment behavioral biases. And it a bit falls under the, what's more commonly known as like base rate neglect. I just think calling it storytelling bias adds a different, spin to it that is first of all sounds more interesting than base rate neglect. But it also, flips it and highlights, why we neglect base rates. And so storytelling bias, it's interesting. I read this book called Tell Me a Story by this AI pioneer named Roger Schenck, right? And he wrote a book, this book, Tell Me a Story, in 1995. So if you think back to 1995 and compare it to what's going on with AI today, like in 1995, we had, I think definitely the first, maybe the second Terminator movie, and some science fiction, but, really hadn't done much in the way of artificial intelligence. But what he says in this book, which is fascinating, is one of the big challenges with AI, and AI passing what's known as the Turing test. And the Turing test was something formulated by Alan Turing. So, he was famous in the 40s as one of the big code breakers in Britain in the, Enigma machine, and is arguably the creator conceptually of modern day computers. But he had created this test of, will there be a time period someday? How can a computer, trick a human to think that they're interacting with another human, right? So that's passing the Turing test. And there's like movies like Ex Machina, which is just a great movie, about this sort of thing. So, Roger Schenck was writing, one of the big challenges, or maybe the big challenge with AI passing the Turing test, is that the way that humans interact is we tell each other stories. So I'll tell you a story of something that happened, and you'll tell me one back. And your story back will typically be relevant to my story. And what that story will do will convey to me that you've heard me and you understand. And then I'll tell you one back, and it'll go back and forth. And by the way, as a side note, this is what I think is so weird about going to a therapist, because you will tell them a story about your life and they don't tell you one back. They won't say, well, here's what's happened in my life, or here's what happened to another patient, because they don't do that. They just ask you another question. And then it's like sort of bizarre, right? Like you go on and you have this situation where there's just like, you're the only one telling stories. So in fact, we judge each other's intelligence by the quality of stories that we tell. So like if you go out and you meet a person, or if you're someone that's dating and you go on a date, and then afterwards someone says, oh, how intelligent was, Carl or whatever, you'll say, you won't realize it, but the way that you will evaluate Carl's intelligence is, what quality of stories did Carl tell me? How relevant were they to mine, et cetera. And the reason we evolved to be storytellers, it's because, again, it comes back to a survival advantage, everything else evolutionary. And, there are other mammals or animals that work in small groups, but humans are the only species that works in a large scale group. So, there's something called, Dunbar's number, that you can really only know 150 people, or know them by name and by appearance, and know something about them, right? But if you think about it, we have all these groups that are much bigger. You can work for a company. I used to work for Arthur Andersen. We had 88,000 employees, and I identified as, an Arthur Andersen employee. And there were certain stories about how, we served clients and what we did, or, nations. Like there's certain narratives and stories around, being an American, or, being a Brit, a Canadian, et cetera, et cetera. And, religions as well. There's certain stories that different religions have, about, creation and what the religion stands for, and et cetera, et cetera. So we can believe as a species all these things. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to work in bigger groups and to have shared myths and shared experiences. And so because of all this, we pay outsized attention to stories. And what this means from an investment perspective and just making decisions in everyday life is that we rarely stop to consider the base rate of what's happening. So, I'll give you an example. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in there, and could you just briefly define what a base rate is? I feel like this is a topic that isn't discussed too often, but I first learned it from Buffett, and I think it's just an incredible insight. So please define what a base rate really is.
Yeah. So let's talk about what a base rate is. And really it's comes down to statistics, like what is the probability of something happen in a given situation. So for instance, we needed to send my daughter's passport to her. So my younger daughter's off at school and is applying to study abroad. And, we were discussing, should we wait till she came home for spring break, or should we like UPS or FedEx it to her? And it was interesting. My wife made a good point. She said, I read the story that popped up on, social media of, somebody that was FedExing something really important. I forget now what it was and how it got lost. And like, it was something that was basically, irreplaceable. And so I don't think we should, FedEx the passport. If it got lost, this would be horrible. And, I ended up agreeing with her. I said, yeah, the risk is too high. Like if the passport gets lost, like she may not be able to, get a replacement in time and to get a visa and to study abroad. So we decided to wait till she came home a few weeks later, which had a negative effect on the timeline. But really another way of thinking about it is we could have researched what's the base rate, like how many FedEx envelopes go missing, and we could have weighed this one story that we heard of this person on social media that had something irreplaceable lost by FedEx. We could have weighed that against the 0.0001%. I haven't looked it up, so I don't know what it is. Chance it would have been lost. But neither of us did that. It was only later, that I was actually thinking about, we didn't apply, the base rate. And other base rates are things like, the vast majority of startup businesses fail. Like, less than 30% of it make it to their 10th anniversary. Or, the majority of stocks, publicly traded stocks, underperform the market. So over any given year, any given 10 or 20 year time period, 2/3, 3/4, even 80% of stocks underperform the market. So like you would use that base rate to inform, should I be buying a single individual stock or even 5, knowing that the chances are that most, if not all the stocks I will pick will underperform the market over the next, 10 or 20 years. So it behooves us as investors to think of the base rate. But the problem we run into is because we're primed to pay attention to stories, we first of all, we hear stories of other investors making outsized returns, right? So you hear about, the investor that was, exactly. They were in the hot IPO or they, this or that investment. And we talk to our friends, and our friends typically talk to us if they're going to talk about investments, about their investment victories, et cetera. But also we're being, we're being sold stories. We're being told stories, even if you're just looking at investing in a single stock, the company has a story to tell as part of their marketing. They may not necessarily be trying to sway investors, but they're putting forth, like, just think about like Facebook, which is now, meta platforms, kind of based on the whole metaverse concept. Like, they're putting out the story of what they see the future being and how they're going to take advantage of that. And, if you said, I'm going to spend any time at all reading about whether I should buy Meta stock, you're going to get the story about the future that they're going to be, selling you. And we hit this as investors all the time. And, in my book, I think the most fascinating the study on this that I've read was one of medical decision-making, where basically they told these volunteers, you have a fictitious disease and there's two different drugs. One has a 50% effectiveness rate, and then the other one they would vary. And the other one, let's say it has a 90% effectiveness rate. So it'd be like this: Clay, you have a disease, it will kill you left untreated. Drug A has a 50% effective rate. Drug B has a 90% effective rate. But then they'd tell you two stories. About the 50% drug, they would tell you a neutral story. Chris has taken the drug. We don't know if it's going to work. The second drug, Pat has taken the drug. It's not working. She's blind and can no longer walk, and her death is imminent. All right. So based on that, most people in this situation picked the 50% effective drug instead of the 90% effective. Like the 90% effective drug is, based on clinical trials and FDA approval and all this blah, 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 blah. But one story swayed most people to pick the less effective drug because there was a negative story attached. And when they said this drug B is 30% effective, it told a positive story. Like 80% of people still picked the less effective drug because the positive story was attached. So it's not even just an investment concept. And what I think is fascinating, and as I've dug into, the storytelling bias, is pay attention. I say this to all listeners: pay attention to how, when you interact with people, you tell each other stories. And then when you go to make a decision, how you're almost certain to pull out a single story that you heard, a news story, something you heard on social media, something you heard from a friend, to inform your decision. And you probably won't go research what the base rate is, which is, how often, what really happens in the real world and how that should affect your decision. And I'll tell you, like, I do it too. And I've become expert on the storytelling bias. And I laugh at myself how often I succumb to it, like I did with the FedEx story that I just told. So again, like I feel good with our decision because we couldn't take the risk of not, of not FedExing the passport, but I didn't stop to consider the base rate. I jumped into the story and was like, oh, I don't want that to happen. Great story, honey.
Yeah,
it's really hard.
I think the case of the IPOs is a perfect example where an IPO might have a great story and it might make a ton of sense to you, but if you invest, you should keep in mind that the base rate is really low for the success of IPOs. And then there's all these incentives for, the investment managers trying to pitch it and the company wanting to get a lot of attention. But I don't want to hold you too long. And I wanted to ask you a couple questions since you're in the wealth management industry. We've had a number of guests on the show that have claimed what I'll call the death of the 60-40 portfolio now that inflation is here to stay, and there's all these reasons for why it structurally may be around for the years to come. And I just wanted to ask if you have adjusted your portfolio or your clients' portfolios to account for a potential inflationary environment or regime, if at all.
Yeah. So again, a little bit about our company. So we're a multifamily office. We oversee help our clients with about $15 billion of wealth. And about 63 client families we work with. So that's a bit about what we do. And, we don't really have, here's our exact model portfolio we should do for clients. It's pretty custom and based on what they need in terms of cash flow and things. But that being said, we don't have many portfolios that are 60-40. We tend to be the kind of we're more like the 80-20 or 70-30, sometimes 90-10, sometimes 95-5. It just really depends on the client. But as we've dug into inflation, which we've done, numerous times over our, 21-year history, there's a few interesting things about inflation. First of all, economists still debate what causes inflation exactly and what to do about it. So it's pretty interesting. And what is the big driver of inflation also tells you what asset classes might do better versus not. So it's kind of tough. You can look back into the 70s where you really had this, this cost push inflation. A lot of it was driven by the oil crisis and you had these high labor costs. You had a lot of labor unions in the 70s that, a much higher percentage of workers were in labor unions. So it was really hard when there was, low economic growth or declining profitability. You couldn't really cut wages and things. So that was like, one situation. We've had different situations that have been more driven by monetary policy. So, the Fed, being, too loose for too long. And then you have times like we have now that are probably a combination of a bunch of different things, is, partly driven by monetary policy, but definitely fiscal spending and the rescue that was done out of COVID, but then combined with all these supply chain issues. And, in each era, you can't just say this is the investment asset that's going to work. I mean, you look at, TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities, and those haven't done well over this inflationary, time period, because this inflation adjustment has been overwhelmed by, the rise of interest rates, and there wasn't a buffer. So it's tough to say exactly what you should be in as an inflation hedge. I'll tell you, during all these time periods, if you look long term, the best performer with relative to inflation has just been equities. So whether public equities or private equities. So we've pretty much have stuck to our original, asset allocations with clients. We know that, there are time periods it's not going to look as good and others that it's going to look better. I'll tell you, like, for the history of our firm, we've had an allocation to, non-US stocks. And, that was great in the aughts, but since the financial crisis until 2022 and so far this year, it's been a huge drag. Well, clients going, oh my gosh, like, will the pain never end? We're like, let's continue to rebalance and buy more international stocks, and it'll cycle back. And that's really how we view, these asset allocations. And, for instance, if we had a client that's 60-40, we would say, the best investment behavior you can have is not outguess it and to continue to rebalance back to 60-40. Yeah, it's been, it was 2022 was brutal for a bond investor, but, bonds are looking more attractive now, and, they're going to look, better and worse over time. So we're really about, the discipline of, and we're really about behavior. What gives you the best behavior? And we find for investors that having more of a static asset allocation and trying not to outguess. And we've done a lot of paying attention to what other firms do in terms of their tactical allocations. And, they're right sometimes, but they're wrong a lot. And a lot of times they don't work out. And I think an issue is investors feel like they should be doing something, when most of the time the better thing to do is not to do anything. So, I think, people worried about inflation and interest rates and, the allocation of their portfolio are better just to back up and think more in like 20 and 40 and 50 year timeframes, and just realize, an important mental model is, you're not going to, you're going to be wrong as much or more than you're going to be right, probably. And again, not have overconfidence and realize that there's all these other people that are in the market, and the price of everything is established by buyers and sellers. And, people tend to think, oh, well, I know more than these other people do. When I'm selling a stock, woohoo, and look at those dumb buyers, or vice versa. And to have a little bit more humility and say, there's all these other people, all these other firms, and realize that they have a reason for what they're doing. And that's part of the thing that's setting, it's setting the path of interest rates, and it's setting what's happening in the stock market, and realizing that maybe, you don't know more than they do. And maybe even if you did, would that really help you? So I think it's just a big healthy dose of humility.
I'm also curious, with the stock market trading at historically extended levels, look at things like the Shiller PE ratio. Has that changed how you advise clients in projecting future returns going forwad?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We don't really project future returns going forward. I have an entire chapter in my book called The Trivial Many versus the Vital Few. So the investment industry continues to make projections using bell curve statistics, which aren't applicable. And everybody in the investment world will go, oh yeah, there's fat tails. which basically means the model doesn't work. So we don't spend a lot of time, taking, different capital market inputs as they're called. Here's our projection for what's going to happen over the next, 5-10 years, and, our projected standard deviation, our projected, or historical correlations. And, here's the model that it's going to put out in terms of what your asset allocation should be. We don't put a lot of, stock in that. What we do instead is do a few things. We first of all, we'll stress test portfolios based on some extreme events in the past. So we'll, and when setting asset allocations or coming back and, looking at them again, we'll say, how would this portfolio fared in, 1929 to 1932, or, in the 70s, or how would have it done during the dot-com crash or the great financial crisis, or even during COVID now? And then also, how would it have done, during, kind of the roaring 80s and 90s in the stock market? How would it have done? How would it have performed during the Great Moderation in the aughts and, different time periods, to start seeing kind of this actual range of what really happened, which is a lot more wild randomness than the bell curve model predicts. So that's the first thing we do. Secondly, we do show clients, based on different price to earnings ratios, where it's the 1 year trailing, the 1 year forward, the as you mentioned, the Shiller, the cyclically adjusted price to earnings ratio. We'll look at that and say, historically, what sort of range of returns can you expect? And yeah, when the Shiller PE is at like 25, really what we say to clients is, you'd rather not start from here, but here we are, right? And here's your range of returns. And I think it's important to look at the range at each of these different, if you broke it into deciles of, different Shiller PEs, to look at the range of returns instead of saying, based on the starting PE, here's what your expected return is, and then put that into a model. Instead, say, here's the range of returns, and let's set expectations. And if, we're looking at, what is a withdrawal rate that your portfolio, makes sense, take into account maybe some of these expected returns. But yeah, it's difficult to predict the future. What we tend to be is a little bit more all weather, and, really relying on just the math of rebalancing and discipline, and really accepting the uncertainty inherent. I think, clients love when you give them, here's your, this portfolio gives you this expected return, this expected level of volatility, and let's dig into Sharpe ratios and information ratios and upside and downside, captures of the market and all this stuff. And again, this gives you a false sense of certainty, right? And then people run these Monte Carlo analyses based on that, which is a Monte Carlo analysis is it's a stochastic modeling where they say, if your average return is going to be, 7% with this standard deviation in these asset classes, let's run this 1,000 or 10,000 different ways and, see how many times you fall within, success or whatever. And a few problems. First of all, it's using bell curve. So second problem is if it says you have an 88% chance of success, what does that tell you? Like, is that enough? Do you need to get to 100%? 538's model for the chances of Donald Trump winning was about 15%. And he did. And people were like, oh, you predicted it wrong. And Nate Silver was like, no, I said there was a 15% chance. 15% happens 15% of the times. This was one of those times. And, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Mm-hmm. But like, if you have a 12% chance of failure, I mean, if the bell curve was correct, you would fail 12% of the time. But again, the bell curve is, I think, a tool that is way overused in investments. And it's kind of like economics, where all these economists run around and they're looking for like something akin to the law of physics to use to describe what's happening in the economy. And this Professor Andrew Lowe of MIT wrote an entire book on this called Adaptive Markets. And he proposed the adaptive markets theory, which is that the economy isn't like physics with its immutable rules, like, Newton's laws of motion. It's like biology, which is evolution. And markets evolve and they change. And, that's really how we should view the investment world, less as here are these rules and this math that we can apply to what's going to happen in the future. And a little bit more, it could go this way, and I'm using my hands here. I'm showing that there's this huge swath of possible realities. And what we do know is a bunch of unexpected things are going to happen. There's going to be pandemics and wars that we didn't expect. And there's natural disasters and boats stuck in canals that disrupt, you remember this from a few years ago, that disrupt global trade. And, there's sorts of things are going to happen. Sometimes the number one regular season NHL team of all time, the Boston Bruins, who had the most wins of any team in NHL history, sometimes they lose in the first round to like the number 8 seed, which is what just happened last night. I mean, this is recording on May 1st. So sometimes the unexpected happens. Like, I was looking at, the picks going into, the first round of the NHL playoffs. And like I looked at, dozens and dozens of picks through all these, ESPN, the Athletic and everything. I saw exactly one person who picked the Panthers to win. And I bet he did so just because he wanted to be an outlier in case he was right. And I guess if this was investment, you would see all these things. So he'd have his picks for the next round, who's going to win the Stanley Cup. And you'd see these things like on CNBC and all these other financial news outlets, the person who picked the Bruins to win, the Panthers to win, is going to tell you what's going to happen. And you can bet accordingly. And everybody would plow in when like this is just one dude that got lucky with his pick. And that's what happens in investment circles. You see it all the time. The one investment person who, saw what was going to happen in, 2008 or, during COVID or, whatever, here's their next stock pick or their next, what can happen in the economy. And we all pile in. So anyway, I could go on and on.
Well, John, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was absolutely wonderful. If the audience enjoyed this episode, I'd encourage you to go check out John's new book, The Uncertainty Solution. John, before I let you go, how about you give the handoff to learn more about you and learn more about your book and whatever other resources you'd like to send them to?
Yeah, so I have a website that is johnmjennings.com, John, M as in Michael, Jennings.com. And on it has a little bit about my book, but importantly, in the menu, there's a tab that says IFOD, which stands for Interesting Fact of the Day. And that is my blog that about twice a week, I write on things that have usually nothing to do with investing. They're just things that people, might find interesting. So it's very, very, wide ranging. Some of my most popular ones have been what happens to a bullet shot straight up in the air? Why do females generally have neater handwriting than males? Why do competitors often put stores close to each other? Like, why do you see a CVS and Walgreens on the same block or a Lowe's and a Home Depot? Why does that happen? So yeah, it's just, various interesting things like that. Would, love always to have more subscribers to my blog.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, John. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Clay. Enjoyed it.
It is why Munger has said, it takes character to sit there with all that cash and do nothing. I didn't get to where I am today by going after mediocre opportunities.